It's Tuesday, March 3rd. I'm talking to Joe Comartin, Member of Parliament for Windsor-Tecumseh and the NDP's Justice Critic. The Conservatives brought in two pieces of legislation on gang crime and on drug crimes last week. I'd like to know your views of them and whether I know that you're committed to supporting the first. Are you committed to supporting both?
No, actually, our caucus is opposed to the drug bill. It introduces a number of mandatory minimum penalties for what I'll call low-grade drug offenses, including, in fact, some possession offenses. But it's mostly, even though it's supposed to be targeted at gangs, the reality is that the people who are going to get caught in this legislation, from a criminal standpoint, are people who are the low end, the small suppliers, street level ones, and the strategy of going after the drug lords, the ones who really manipulate the system. This legislation is not going to do anything for it at all.
Who is going to be caught in this? How are those little people that you mentioned going to be caught up?
Well, the mandatory minimums, and there's some that the least one is a year. So you're going to have small people in the grow-ops who oftentimes are just operating that building where the operation is going on for marijuana, and it is marijuana. It's not stronger drugs. They're the ones who are probably going to get the majority of the charges are going to be against people who are just operating those places for organized crime.
What is the history of mandatory minimum sentencing as regards drug crimes in the United States and elsewhere?
Well, it's been primarily used only in the United States. For instance, England has very few mandatory minimums, but the United States began using them probably back in the Reagan years, so going back 25, 30 years even. What has begun to happen in the last 5 years is a number of the states, because these are all state laws, a number of the states have been repealing those for two reasons. One, they don't work. That is, the amount of drug consumption, the amount of drug crimes has continued on, all the violence attendant to it. But secondly, it has just become too expensive. They put so many people into jail that the states in a number of cases are just not able to afford the jails anymore. I mean, we've got states in the United States that are spending more on incarcerating people than they are spending on their public education systems.
And you're concerned that Canada could go the same route if we adopt this legislation?
In particular, it's a problem because a number of these, like the 1 year, anything under 2 years, you go into provincial jails, prisons. You don't go into the federal system. So here we've got the federal government passing these laws. The vast majority of people who are going to be incarcerated are not going to be incarcerated in the federal system. They're going to be incarcerated in the provincial systems. And the provinces, again, a number of whom can't afford it, are going to have to build more jails.
Do you think that part of the motivation here is, or do you think part of the plan would be a push towards private jails?
We haven't seen any particular sign of that, although Stockwell Day did put in charge of one of his review committees on the federal prisons an individual who brought in the boot camp system in Ontario when Harris was there. Now that system has been shut down under the current Liberal administration because it didn't work. So you'd be thinking there may be some possibility of that, but beyond that, I haven't seen any signs of it.
On a related issue, the RCMP have been repeatedly in the news in recent weeks and years for one problem after another: the missing rescue, the botched rescue in BC, the tasering at Vancouver Airport, and I could go on. What is the symptom underlying these problems with the RCMP, if you may?
My belief is, and it has been for a long time, back when I was practicing law, is that the RCMP are still working on a model that's very authoritarian. It's a military model. So their structure, all of their discipline is based on that model. Our provincial police forces, again, they're not perfect by any means, but they and our municipal police forces, by and large, have moved away from that military model to seeing police officers as professionals and expecting them to be responsible, not just to follow orders, but to use their discretion and make proper decisions. The RCMP administration consistently have been opposed to that kind of an approach. I was hoping under the new commissioner that we might see some changes. I haven't seen that yet. He's only been there less than a year. So I'm still hoping that we may see some change. He doesn't come out of the RCMP background. He comes out of the public service. I'm hoping that we may see some change. But that's where the essential problem is. And I want to say in that regard that, generally speaking, I believe the RCMP individual officers and the lower ranks in particular would like to see this change, where they're treated with a much greater degree of respect in terms of their ability to do their job, as opposed to having to follow sometimes orders that make no sense at all.
Is there a way that you in the legislature, in Parliament, can push for changes in the RCMP, or does it have to be internal through the Commission?
It's probably the latter more. The RCMP legislation that governs them has a very specific clause that requires political people to stay out of day-to-day operations. I think we could do a little bit of putting pressure on them as politicians to begin to look at a different model. But in terms of the mandate, we would actually have to change the law to allow politicians to dictate how they're going to administer. And then, of course, that's dangerous when you get political interference in what is, just day-to-day police work. So it's trying to fix that balance so that policy, in fact, is determined by the politicians and day-to-day operations are carried out by the force. I think there is a bit more we could be doing. I've not been satisfied with our Solicitor Generals or now Ministers of Public Safety that they're willing to do enough to intervene when I think clearly a policy has been breached and our political leaders, our ministers, don't intervene at that point. I think we saw it in the Maharar case, for instance. There were clear breaches of policy that I think they should have been called on the carpet for, that the ministers just said, no, that's operations, we can't do anything about it.
Thank you very much, Comartin.
Okay, you're welcome.